welcome back to the Critical Thinking Tools podcast. In the last episode, we talked about Plato's cave. That's an important tool of skepticism and understanding that there may be something true out there that's beyond ourselves. Likewise, today we're going to talk about the Enlightenment. And in the Enlightenment, there are several tools that are worth knowing to aid your critical thinking today. One basic tool is dividing thought into two different categories. One is rationalism and the other is empiricism. This is a foundation of skeptical thought in science and in the humanities too. One branch of the Enlightenment was the rationalism branch, and rationalism just means theorizing, creating theories out of axioms, building mathematical proofs, building ethical arguments from first principles is also rationalism. Building legal arguments from first principles is also rationalism. So rationalism is theorizing. The good kind of rationalism is theorizing, but in a very careful and methodical way. You might link early rationalism to Plato and the way that Plato argued that there were pure forms that were perfect, and how he used rationalism to try and explain the world. Although, of course, all of these thinkers also did delve into empiricism too, so this is a very vague way of categorizing these thinkers. An important early thinker in the Enlightenment was René Descartes in the 1600s. He came up with the idea of doubt and building from that severe doubt, a kind of skepticism. Baruch Spinoza was also an important rationalist and perhaps was one of the most important rationalists to lead the Enlightenment movement in the direction of atheism. Other thinkers like Gottfried Leibniz and Immanuel Kant are also important in developing this line of rationalism, of theorizing carefully, building ethical arguments, building scientific arguments from as carefully as you can from thought and axioms. Of course, other people were important in the development of rationalism too, like Isaac Newton, for example, but you might place Isaac Newton in both rationalism and the empirical camp as well. So rationalism is a very fruitful way of building knowledge, acquiring knowledge. The other branch of thought that's also aimed at acquiring new knowledge and truths that are useful is empiricism. So empiricism is much less theorizing and much more collecting of data or sense information from our senses, right? This might be traced back, and is by some people, to Aristotle, who of course learnt from Plato's skepticism, and from the building of thoughts and theories came to the conclusion that acquiring sense data is really important to get to the truth. In the Enlightenment itself, and in the scientific revolution, I should say, Francis Bacon was important in emphasizing the importance of gathering data in science. John Locke was an empiricist as well. His theories spanned a great number of disciplines, especially politics, economics, and science. So his argument was that gathering information, testing your ideas against what actually happens in the world is very important. And Locke went on to be very influential in the creation of the Constitution of the United States. He also had ideas of liberty being important in this empirical system of ideas that he had. And David Hume was another empiricist who followed on from Locke and made adjustments to Locke's ideas and so on. And all of these thinkers are still worthy of reading today. You can see how a lot of our useful ideas about gathering data comes from these early beginnings, or perhaps a rebirth, because I think these ideas have existed in human societies elsewhere as well, but they were reborn in a specific way in the Enlightenment that was very productive. I mean, this is the whole point of this mini lecture, is to point out how much knowledge came from this skeptical movement called the Enlightenment, and what good elements can we take from that, so that we can continue to discover objective truths and to improve human flourishing and so on. I mean, one of the reasons why I think this lecture might be needed is because some of these ideas come under attack in recent years. The argument that a certain race of people were involved in the Enlightenment, a certain gender of people were involved in the Enlightenment, and the kind of cynical view that science and the Enlightenment was created as a system of power. That cynical view of the Enlightenment is quite damaging to all of the useful ideas that we can still pull from. And a lot of these ideas are worth preserving today rather than being thrown out because of the gender or the ethnicity of the scientists who came up with some of these ideas. And you can see how important these ideas are. And there is a lot of irony in the fact that these thinkers came up with these ideas such as anti-authoritarianism, liberty, progress and toleration. But the irony is that it took so many years since these ideas were created for them to come to fruition in society. And I think a lot of these ideas have come to fruition, and the irony is that sometimes they took 100 years or so to move from the philosophers to society and into law. Let's start with some of the useful things that come out of the Enlightenment. First, the Enlightenment came up with the new idea, or a rebirth of the idea, of anti-authoritarianism in developing knowledge and in who knows the truth. So the idea of the objective truth came to fruition, where the objective truth is something that's very difficult to get to, and it's not contained in the mind of a special group of people. It was a movement of anti-subjectivism, in other words, that what people thought to be subjectively true was put into question by the Enlightenment, the skepticism that was reborn in the Enlightenment. And it was also important in that there was an anti-Gnosticism branch of the Enlightenment that argued that there's no special group of people who are Gnostics. In other words, they're all-knowing. The idea that knowledge was within the human mind was debunked. The idea started to develop, not so much that there was some very special people who just know the truth, such as, previously that would have been kings, pharaohs, religious leaders, and the aristocracy, that kind of thing. The Enlightenment, for all its faults, brought in the idea that the truth should be gotten to in two different ways, either through good argument, that's nothing to do with the person's position in life, so that's rationalism, through careful argument, or through gathering data. And again, that's nothing to do with the specialness of the person, it's all to do with having good evidence for what you are claiming to be true. Right, so it's a move away from knowledge coming from authority, and it's moving towards knowledge coming from either argument, rationalism, or data, empiricism. So those are very important ideas that did not come naturally to humans. And even today you see the idea of subjectivism and how some people hold the truth coming back into society in every generation, and then every generation has to, draw on this ancient knowledge from the Enlightenment that no, knowledge comes from good arguments and from collecting data. Another important part of the Enlightenment movement was the idea of liberty. And this idea was developing before the Enlightenment too, in a kind of begrudging way, in that the aristocracy, the religious leaders, the monarchy, just practically speaking, had to give liberty to individuals in society to reduce rebellions, to reduce wars, and so on. So just for practical reasons, liberty was growing in European societies, such as in British common law, for example. The compromises, the laws that came in the centuries before the Enlightenment were starting to grant liberties to the populace. Not enough. So the Enlightenment had an ideal of liberty in some of the philosophical writings of John Locke, for example, and others. So the ideas of a free society, of free speech being needed to gather information, free speech being needed in the press, free speech being needed in science so that you can come up with new theories without being worried of being punished for them. The idea of academics and universities being able to have free inquiry came to a forefront in this age, and the whole of these ideas might be summarized with the expression scientific liberalism. So freedom in science to come up with new ideas. And this, of course, was a reaction to the old way of doing things, where if you were to suggest that maybe the sun was the center of the solar system, you might face banishment, book burning, and possible imprisonment, as some of the early pioneers of astronomy faced, such as Galileo. So all of these things I've been talking about led to an explosion of good ideas and progress in science, the law, economics, and so on. Another idea coming out of the Enlightenment is that there should be competition of ideas, or a marketplace of ideas, where you put your ideas out into books, into journal articles, and the criticism from others is allowed, and the best ideas survive this critical process of competition between ideas. Another important part of the Enlightenment is boldness, being bold enough to question old theories, and that was dangerous in a transitional period from monarchy and religious rule to the Enlightenment and the development of constitutional republics and democracies. So the expression sapere aude came from René Descartes at the beginning of the Enlightenment, and the idea is that another ethic is that we must be bold in moving forward to acquiring new knowledge, or more often than not, bold enough to debunk ideas that are so revered in society in a way that might actually be dangerous to do. Another ethic and development to come out of the Enlightenment is the idea of progress, which was very important at that time because there was a lot of progress to be made. Part of the idea of progress and liberalism was the idea of toleration of other ideas, other religions, living side by side with other people in society who have a different religious view or a different view of knowledge, and tolerating those different ideas. That's an important part of the Enlightenment. So it's a move away from trying to go to war because there's a section of society that doesn't believe in a certain religious book, for example, and a move towards religious freedom and toleration. Now that does not mean respect, right? So respect is different from toleration. In this Enlightenment thought, you do not have to respect or agree with other people's religions or other people's science or philosophy, anything like that. You only have to tolerate it, right? So this is very important, and there was quite a to-do in the last year at Cambridge University in the UK, where academics were asked to sign or agree with something that said that you have to respect this idea, and this idea. And some of the academics got together and argued that the word respect should be replaced with the word tolerate, and indeed it was. So that is a very important Enlightenment idea, that you do not have to agree with something, you don't you should not be forced to agree with something. You should not be forced to respect an idea that you think is preposterous, but you have to have toleration of other people's ideas and allow them to speak. Another important idea that came out of the Enlightenment that was a step forward from previous centuries before the scientific revolution was the idea that the goal of society would be human flourishing. Now, this is called humanism, where the goal of all the sciences, all the humanities, the ultimate goal is human happiness, or the pursuit of happiness, whichever way you want to call it, which is new, right? Because before this time, the goal of some societies was to gain extra territory, right? Or to uphold the glory of a religion, or the goal of the whole society might have been to reinstate or bring about glory for the king, that kind of thing. So the goal was sometimes not at all human flourishing. The goal of previous societies was quite often conquering other societies and so on, and acquiring gold. That was an old way of thinking. The Enlightenment brought in some new ideas, such as society should be organized to aim for human flourishing, and that's an important step forward that has led to improvements in medicine, standard of life, longevity, and so on. So it's been a very productive set of ideas that is worth considering to be preserved in future generations. And of course, scientific skepticism was a deep part of the Enlightenment, right? It was one way of thinking of this movement is that it's a rebirth of ancient Greek skepticism. In the skepticism schools of Athens, you might think of previous lecture on Plato's cave as being part of that skeptical canon. But that's a very important part of the Enlightenment, the idea of doubt. And of course, René Descartes kind of kicked off the Enlightenment with the idea of extreme skepticism, and then you build on what you do know from that skepticism. So his extreme skepticism was, I think, therefore I am. So he's starting from a viewpoint of the only thing that I can be certain of as I build this system of rationality is that I exist because I'm thinking. Of course, being so skeptical is not very fruitful, so you have to kind of loosen that skepticism to make discoveries, and scientists did indeed loosen their skepticism so that they can make progress. Anyway, so that is an emphasis on the good parts of the Enlightenment. I know full well that there was quite a delay in the moral development and putting into law some of the ideas of the Enlightenment. So the idea of freedom, for example, obviously was in philosophers' minds in the Enlightenment, and it took quite a lot of years before it became law, and it's been a struggle, of course. For example, the Enlightenment affected the American Constitution, which said that all men are created equal, which is a step forward in thought and philosophy. But in practice, it took another 100 years before slavery was banned, and then another 100 years before Jim Crow was reversed. So another criticism of the Enlightenment might be that, and I do think this is true, that scientific discovery of materials, of weaponry, preceded moral philosophy. So moral philosophy was always trying to catch up with these scientific discoveries. So steel production was perfected in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and sometimes that steel was used amorally, let's put it that way. And I think some of the inventions, such as weapons, preceded the moral philosophy that we needed to develop in society to make sure that those discoveries do not do harm to others. And I think this understanding of human psychology has come late in the game too. It's only in the 20th century that we started to understand cognitive biases, in-group and out-group biases to a certain extent, so that a moral understanding of what is right in the world is much better than it was during the early period of the Enlightenment. Now we know that it's moral to be empathetic towards outgroups much more than we did before that social psychology work was done in the 20th century. But nevertheless, it's the Enlightenment itself that started off these goals of human flourishing that then have become more perfected in the 20th and 21st century as we learn from psychology. And psychology, of course, only came into the scientific realm just over 100 years ago. So obviously there's some moral aspects of the Enlightenment that took a long time to catch up to the chemistry and the physics and the material science. So that's my argument for why the Enlightenment is a very valuable thing. The ideas that came out of the Enlightenment are a very valuable thing. The argument is that it led to increased lifespan, to the curing of diseases, to improvements in quality of life in our modern times. And a lot of those ideas that came along with the Enlightenment, such as liberty, human flourishing, scientific skepticism, rationalism, empiricism, need to be maintained today to guarantee that we don't go downhill back into a dark age. If these Enlightenment ideals are undermined by postmodernism or critical theory, I do predict that there will be a decrease in human flourishing and a decrease in liberty in society.